final victory of the anti-imperialists is certain. Contribution to the International Theoretical Conference on Imperialism and War, organized by the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, NDFP, on October 15, 2023, in Amsterdam. The current situation is, in short, World War III. World War III began with the escalation of the war in Ukraine in February 2022. As of October 2023, the probabilities of the spread of war throughout Eastern Europe and of the outbreak of war in East Asia are very high, and a new war has already broken out in the Middle East, West Asia. In other words, World War III has started in Eastern Europe and spread through the Middle East to East Asia. World War I was an inter-imperialist war, World War II was a global anti-fascist war, and World War III is a global anti-imperialist war. World War II initially unfolded as an inter-imperialist war but changed phase when the Soviet Union formed a world anti-fascist front with some imperialist countries. World War I resulted in the emergence of the first socialist country, and World War II led to the emergence of a worldwide socialist camp. Lenin accomplished the historic feat of socialist revolution by winning the Russian Revolution. This was based on the lessons of the Paris Commune with the scientific conviction that the weakest link in the chain of imperialism would be broken first as a result of the struggle between imperialist countries for colonies to seize super profits from them, enabled by the uneven development of capitalism in the stage of monopoly capitalism. In this process, Lenin's struggle against the revisionism of Bernstein and Kautsky in the Second International is a great example of an ideological struggle that goes down in the history of the world revolution. As with the right opportunist tendency of Bernstein and Kautsky, Trotsky's leftist opportunism posed another challenge to the international communist movement. The criterion of truth is practice. The great victory of Stalin's theory of socialism in one country and the World Anti-Fascist Front, which inherited and innovated Lenin's theory of the victory of socialism in one country, dealt a fatal blow to Trotskyism, just as Lenin had struck a fatal blow to Kautskyism. We note today that the absurd imperialist pyramid theory, which was given by the leadership of the Communist Party of Greece, KKE, in the early 2000s and elaborated in 2013 by the former General Secretary of KKE, Aleka Popariga, is no different in essence from Kautsky's ultra-imperialism, and that the KKE leadership's denial of any united front and overuse of ultra-revolutionary slogans have surpassed Trotsky's leftist opportunism. Imperialist pyramid defines every capitalist country as imperialist without exception and defines one country as capitalist as long as it has a market and trade. According to this bizarre theory, Iran, Venezuela, Rwanda, Mozambique, and even Cuba and North Korea are imperialist countries. We are also outraged that the KKE leadership is trying to impose its revisionist and opportunist line on other parties, and when it fails, it splits them up, such as the Communist Party of Peoples of Spain, the Communist Party of Italy, the Communist Party of Bolivia, the Communist Party of Argentina, etc. The de facto organizer of SolidNet, a long-standing meeting of the Communist and the Workers' Party of the World, has raised this pseudo-theory and has led splits of the international communist movement in the wake of the war in Ukraine so that SolidNet is now completely divided into pro-KKE and anti-KKE forces, and its life is at stake. In addition, the leadership of the KKE recently unilaterally dissolved the European Communist Initiative, a long-standing coalition of European communist parties, once again drawing fierce criticism from within the international communist movement. In the past, at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in February 1956, Nikita Khrushchev decided on a revisionist line. The following year, staunch communists who opposed it, including Nikos Zacharidis, the general secretary of the KKE, were expelled from the KKE under the direction of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. From then on, the KKE leadership went down a thoroughly revisionist path, consistently supporting Gorbachev's reform policies. The historical roots of revisionism, opportunism, and sectarianism in the leadership of the KKE go back to the Khrushchev era when Zacharidis was expelled. The KKE under Zacharidis, which was at the height of the national liberation struggle and class liberation struggle and fought Khrushchev's revisionism to the death, should never be confused with the KKE under revisionists, opportunists and sectarians, as they are essentially different. Russia is a capitalist country that has a socialist legacy. In Russia, the financial oligarchs cannot control politics and the economy, and its resources are exported, and capital flows in from abroad. Gas and electricity are supplied to people cheaply by the policy of voluntary deviation. We have to keep in mind that Russia was essentially a colony of Western imperialism during the 1990s and early 2000s. Based on the historical experience of the multiple invasions of Moscow, a capital city surrounded by plains, Russia established the policy of defensive expansionism in the military field, with the Carpathians, Caucasus, and Ural Mountains as the borders. In accordance with the strategy of Zbigniew Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard, the Western imperialist forces formed the anti-Russian front, encircling the Carpathians Mountains and connecting France, Germany, Poland, Ukraine, and staging color revolutions around Russia, including Belarus, Georgia, and Kazakhstan. The most successful case was the Maidan coup in Ukraine in 2014. It is no longer a secret that the US and NATO set up, trained and armed the neo-Nazi forces including the Azov Battalion in order to succeed in invasion of Donbass and to push into Russia. Russia, which was at risk of being torn apart like another Yugoslavia, had no choice but to conduct the war in Ukraine against NATO and its stooge fascist forces. It is true that China is a socialist country, with the formulation of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Belt and Road Initiative is a part of defensive expansionism in economic field to break through an imperialist force's economic blockade against China. The Communist Party of China leads its country, and the major means of production are nationalized. The nature of the Belt and Road Initiative policy is to break through the imperialist force's economic blockade policy against China. China doesn't thoroughly stand fast to the classical principle of socialism like North Korea, but it doesn't reject the principle of socialism itself. It is important to distinguish between what is true and what is false, between matters of principle and flexibility, strategy and tactics. In the end, it is the only practice that silences all debate. Suppose Taiwan separates and becomes independent. In that case, dominoes of secession will follow in Hong Kong, Xizang, Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia. These are cunning schemes pursued relentlessly by the imperialist allies, including the US, to dismantle Chinese socialism, like the strategy of the Grand Chessboard. While the US decisively promotes the separation and independence of Taiwan, the reasons the US declares the new Washington Consensus and jumps the gun, saying de-risking is a deceptive scheme to blame China for the war in Taiwan. China must not permit the secession of Taiwan. The U.S. has created this situation by strengthening the U.S.-Taiwan diplomatic relations, by pushing the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan and the President of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen's trip to the U.S. Like trains running towards each other, collisions are inevitable. Socialism is socialism, and capitalism is capitalism. Socialism is a society in which the working people, including the working class, own the government and the means of production, and is led by a revolutionary party of the working class. In contrast, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, the eve of socialism. Calling all capitalism imperialism, or even calling socialism imperialism, is today not just a theoretical error but the most severe practical error of all. It leads to the decisive error of characterizing the ongoing war in Ukraine as an inter-imperialist war and the impending war in Taiwan as an inter-imperialist war. Some communist camps are making the fatal mistake of struggling against Russia and China rather than NATO, the US, and imperialists, and defining the force behind the struggle as the target of the struggle and the allies as the enemy. It, in turn, supports US and European imperialism and NATO, and is an act to benefit the enemy against the anti-imperialist forces fighting against these imperialist forces. To say the least, even if you don't have a scientific view of imperialism and confuse expansionism with imperialism, the main enemy and main target of the people, including the working class, in the current world revolution is the US imperialism and NATO, a coalition of the US and European imperialist invasion forces. It is an obvious error to put US imperialism and China on the same level, NATO and Russia on the same level, or even to label China and Russia as the emerging to consider them the main enemy and target. The war in Ukraine is an anti-imperialist and anti-fascist war, a war of liberation and a preventive war. It is a war to liberate the people including ethnic Russians from the tyranny of the Ukraine fascist authority. It is a preventive war in response to the liberation of ethnic Russians and others from the tyranny of the Ukrainian fascist authorities and the war that was to follow as a result of NATO's eastern policy toward Russia. The wars both in Taiwan and South Korea are anti-imperialist, national liberation, and national reunification wars. Therefore, it is clear who is on the side of justice and which war is a just war. The South Korean War is precisely an anti-imperialist, anti-fascist war. South Korean Yoon Suk-yeol, who came to power in May last year, is more of a fascist and belligerent than Poroshenko and Zelensky combined. The wars in Taiwan and South Korea are inextricably linked. If the Taiwan War breaks out, the South Korean War breaks out, and if the South Korean War breaks out, the Taiwan War breaks out. The agreement in 1961 between North Korean leader Kim Il-sung and Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai was reaffirmed by President Xi Jinping during his visit to North Korea in 2019. Socialist North Korea joined with Socialist China first, and then Socialist North Korea and China joined with capitalist Russia, which has a socialist heritage, to form a world anti-imperialist front. These three countries are all armed with nuclear and missile weapons. US and European imperialism can never win against these three countries at the same time. Add to this the outbreak of war in the Middle East, and the anti-imperialist front is expanding to new level. In the Sahel region, the anti-France, anti-US, and anti-imperialist regime change are taking place and military tensions in Africa are increasing. The political and economic crisis of imperialism in Latin America, called pink tide, is also deepening. All unscientific theories and analyses that fail to see things as they are, in other words, materialistically and historically, structurally, namely, dialectically, will, in practice, be rapidly crushed as war intensifies. The unscientific concepts of imperialism and the petit bourgeois ideas of revisionism and opportunism will be dealt a decisive blow, both theoretically and practically. The world is rapidly dividing into anti-imperialism and imperialism, justice and injustice. As historical experience proves, the final victory of the anti-imperialist camp, with not only its political and ideological superiority but now also military superior position, is certain. As in the history of the last World War, there may be twists and turns along the way, but today's global cataclysmic period will be driven by the unity of the proletariat of the world and the struggle of the united people to move beyond the Great Transition period and into a Great Heightened period. We are going to keep pushing forward on the path where proletariat and people will become the masters of the regime and the means of production. The final victory of the anti-imperialist struggle for sovereignty and peace is certain. Contribution to the International Rome Peace Conference, hosted by the International Initiative for Peace, on October 27, 2023. World War III is in full swing. Triggered by the war in Ukraine in 2022, World War III is spreading to Taiwan and South Korea and through Palestine in 2023. Today, the probability of contagion in Eastern Europe and an outbreak of war in Eastern Asia is increasingly likely. The current situation, where the war in Palestine is expanding into the Middle East, is definitely sparking wars in East Asia. The root cause of all wars lies in imperialism. Imperialism is driving the world into a war crisis with new Cold War policy and war provocations in order to escape from the unprecedented political and economic crisis. Based on the Grand Chessboard strategy and NATO's eastward policy, imperialism has been plotting to make Russia a second Yugoslavia, using color revolutions and neo-Nazi stormers. This is essentially no different from the strategy to disrupt China, provoking a chain of separationist movements in Hong Kong, Xizang, Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia by completing a secession of Taiwan. New Washington Consensus and de-risking are nothing more than deceptive ruses to shift the responsibility for war to China. Additionally, the US President, the Japanese Prime Minister, and the South Korean President met at Camp David in the US at the end of August to form an Asian version of NATO, and the war exercises against North Korea are being conducted daily in Korea with nuclear bombers and nuclear aircraft carriers. It is no coincidence that Yoon Suk-yeol, who is as fascist and belligerent as Poroshenko and Zelensky combined, took office in South Korea last year and that he is selling arms to Poland and intervening in the war in Ukraine. Today, if either the war in Taiwan or in South Korea breaks out, the other will also automatically break out. In 1950, the Korean War broke out in the midst of the Taiwanese war crisis. When the U.S. Army dragged 16 countries into the Korean War, the Chinese Army had no choice but to join. As the South Korea-U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty was concluded in 1953, North Korea and China agreed, in 1961, to stand together if either one was engaged in an anti-imperialist war. This agreement was reaffirmed in 2019 when Chinese President Xi Jinping visited North Korea to meet with Chairman Kim Jong-un. The recent North Korea-Russia summit in September and the China-Russia summit in October demonstrate that the strategic cooperative relationship between North Korea, China, and Russia is deepening and developing. This situation, where the socialist countries such as North Korea and China and a capitalist country with a legacy of socialism, Russia, create an anti-imperialist front under the banner of anti-imperialism, is reminiscent of the time of the Second World War. Apart from the difference between the World Anti-Fascist War and the World Anti-Imperialist War, there are lots of common points. Through the First World War, an inter-imperialist war, the first socialist country emerged, and through the Second World War, an anti-fascist war, the socialist camp emerged on a global scale. We have confidence that the Third World War, an anti-imperialist war, should be and can be the decisive strike against imperialism and the turning point to achieve global independence and peace. Palestinian people have already begun the strategic struggle to finish the occupation and domination for 75 years since 1948 and the historic struggle to realize freedom and liberation from the river to the sea. While the war in Ukraine is an anti-imperialist and anti-fascist war, a liberation war and preventive war, and the wars in Taiwan and South Korea are anti-imperialist wars, national liberation wars, and reunification wars, the war in Palestine is an anti-imperialist war, anti-Zionist war, and a liberation war. The final victory is always on the side of justice. Even though the progress is achieved through contradictions and vicissitudes, the just liberation war must win. The World Anti-Imperialist Platform was constituted, holding the banner of anti-imperialism high and announcing the Paris Declaration at the International Conference in Paris, France, in October 2022. Having clarified its three major goals as anti-imperialist mass struggle, ideological warfare against opportunism, and consolidation of the international communist forces, the World Anti-Imperialist Platform held international events and anti-imperialist struggles in Belgrade, Serbia last December, and in Caracas, Venezuela last March, and in Seoul, South Korea last May, and has strived to achieve these goals. We, the People's Democracy Party and the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, under the banners of Workers of the World, Unite, and The People United Will Never Be Defeated, will consistently struggle and progress without hesitation and wavering to change the period of the historic Great Turn in which we now live into the new period of the Great Upsurge, and to establish the new society where the working people become the master of the politics and the economy. Anti-imperialist independent forces will certainly win the just war. Contribution to the celebration for the 106th anniversary of the Great October Revolution, hosted by the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, in London, on November 4, 2023. World War III is underway. The war in Ukraine, which began with the Maidan coup in 2014, escalated with Russian special military operation in 2022. As of 2023, the probabilities of expansion of the war in Eastern Europe and of outbreak of war in East Asia are rising. In addition, the recent outbreak of the war in Palestine and its immediate escalation into the war in the Middle East are further increasing military tensions in Eastern Europe and East Asia. The flames of World War III are spreading from Ukraine to Taiwan and South Korea through Palestine. World War I was an inter-imperialist war. While the fact that the weak link in the chain of imperialism could be broken first with the colonial wars between imperialists was the objective condition favorable for the victory of the revolution, combining the Bolsheviks, armed with Leninism, with the Soviets was the subjective force, a decisive factor for the victory of the revolution. Lenin's theory of converting the inter-imperialist war into a domestic war and of thoroughly suppressing the counter-revolutionary forces was derived from the historical lessons of the Paris Commune. World War II was a world anti-fascist war. The Soviet Union won World War II by forming a world anti-fascist front with US-UK imperialism. While World War I created the first socialist country, World War II led to socialist camps on a global scale. After World War II, the imperialist camps were put on the defensive as they declared the Cold War and colluded around US imperialism. World War III is essentially similar to World War II. It is not an inter-imperialist war like World War I, but a continuation and succession of World War II, a world anti-fascist war. This is because socialist North Korea and China form a world anti-imperialist front with capitalist Russia, which has a socialist heritage. The war in Ukraine is an anti-imperialist and anti-fascist war, a liberation war, and a preventive war, and the war in Palestine is an anti-imperialist war, an anti-Zionist war, and a liberation war. The wars in Taiwan War and South Korea, if they break out, will be anti-imperialist wars, national liberation wars, and national reunification wars. It is definitely clear on which side the justice is. In all ages, imperialism has always been the provocateur of war. Imperialism can never be exonerated from the responsibility of instigating or provoking war, not only in World War I and II, but also in the Korean War, Vietnam War, Iraqi War, and the recent wars in Ukraine and Palestine. Neo-Nazism of Zelensky government and Zionism of Netanyahu government are both fascist in nature. Nazism of Hitler was a variant of imperialism that fought an inter-imperialist war, but both neo-Nazism and Zionism are the puppets of imperialism, serving as a storming party troops in wars caused by imperialism. Being a puppet of imperialist and an extreme fascist, Yoon Suk-yeol government in South Korea surpasses both governments. In late August, the leaders of the US, Japan, and South Korea gathered at Camp David in the United States to form the Asian NATO. 1 year of Yoon Suk-yeol government was full of nuclear war practices by US, South Korea, and sometimes even Japan. Under the control of US imperialism, Yoon Suk-yeol government accelerated its fascistization and rushed toward a nuclear war against North Korea and a war in East Asia. The imperialist camp wants to dismantle Russia and China like Yugoslavia, and eliminate DPRK from its existence. Russia, China, and the DPRK have no other option but to wage a decisive struggle in self-defense against these extreme imperialist provocations. The imperialist camp is trying to wage proxy wars in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia under the new Cold War strategy to avoid its own political and economic crisis. De-risking a new Washington consensus is just a deception to put the blame for the war on the opponent. The world has already entered the storm of World War III. The World Anti-Imperialist Platform was formed in Paris on October 2022, with the three main goals of anti-imperialist mass struggle, ideological struggle against opportunism, and strengthening of communist forces proposed by World Anti-Imperialist Forces, including communist forces, reflecting the grave situation of the World War. The People's Democracy Party and the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, played an important role in this process, and we are very proud of this. Since then, World Anti-Imperialist Platform has successfully held international conferences and has vigorously carried out the anti-imperialist struggle in Belgrade, Serbia, in December last year, Caracas, Venezuela, in March this year, and Gwangju and Seoul, South Korea, in May. We have also launched the Platform News website and published the Platform magazine, strengthening the daily anti-imperialist anti-fascist propaganda war and ideological struggle against opportunism. Raising the slogans of workers of the world, unite and the people united will never be defeated, the World Anti-Imperialist Platform will continue the struggle for justice and the march for victory to advance the final victory of the anti-imperialist forces. As the historical experiences show, the war of justice, World War III, must be victorious. The progressive mankind will meet the new high period when the imperialism is decisively damaged, and the world will be greatly transformed into a more self-determined and peaceful place. In preparation for the imminent world war, let us consolidate the anti-imperialist front and strongly carry out the anti-imperialist struggle. Contribution to the Athens International Conference of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, hosted jointly with the Revolutionary Unification, on November 18, 2023. On the Greek revolutionary history, we focus on the life and struggle of Nikos Zachariadis. It is because when Nikita Khrushchev proposed the modern revisionist line at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of Soviet Union in February 1956, he is one of the representative four leaders who were revolutionary opposing the modern revisionist Khrushchev's line. At that time, they were Nikos Zachariadis, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Greece, KK, Enver Hoxha, the General Secretary of the Party of Labour of Albania, PLA, Mao Zedong, the Chairman of the Communist Party of China, CPC, and Kim Il-sung, the General Secretary of the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK. Following the Khrushchev's direction, the KK expelled the large number of the resolute communists, including Zachariadis. Since then, the revisionist and opportunist line of the leadership of the KK has been adhered, supporting the perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, policy of Mikhail Gorbachev. The determined communists, including Zachariadis, even leaving Greece and staying foreign land, had kept holding fast the revolutionary principle and struggling against the revisionist line until the end of their lives. The life and struggle of Zacharias are very instructive also in the light of the realities of the Greece revolutionary movement today. The historical root of the problems of revisionism, opportunism and sectarianism of the present leadership of the KKE cannot be found elsewhere. In the history of revolutions of the humanity, there are more than one or two examples that some once took the revisionist line and stayed on it until the end. So the problem in ideology is deep-seated and stubborn. By the Kautskist and Trotskyist tendencies of the KKE leadership, the ridiculous sophistry imperialist pyramid theory, the unilateral dissolution of European communist initiative in the recent past and the division and disempowerment of Solid Net, the consequences are very serious. The importance of the KKE leadership correcting its historical errors and, away from the wrong line of revisionism, opportunism and sectarianism, holding the revolutionary principles and returning to the correct line of communism and as soon as possible cannot be overemphasized. The current situation is very dangerous where World War III is about to be in full swing. As of the end of 2023, the probabilities of escalation of war in Eastern Europe and of outbreak of war in East Asia are increasingly rising. A new war has begun in the Middle East, West Asia. The mood of war is spreading from Ukraine in Eastern Europe to Palestine in Middle East, and then to Taiwan and South Korea in East Asia. In February 2022, Russia launched an anti-imperialist and anti-fascist war, liberation and preventive war against the provocations of NATO imperialism, and the flames of this war are fueling the struggle for justice of anti-imperialist forces around the world. The struggle for free and liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea is at a turning point today. Anti-Israeli and pro-Palestinian forces are united unprecedentedly in the Middle East, and Israel is deeply divided. Above all, U.S. imperialism and European imperialism are seriously exhausted national power by the war in Ukraine. If the war in East Asia breaks out, the U.S. and European imperialist powers will have to wage armed struggle against the strongest anti-imperialist forces in 3 battlefields. If you look at the East Asian War as 2 battles, Taiwan and South Korea, it is 4 battles, Eastern Europe and the Middle East, Taiwan and South Korea. It should be noted that Russia, China, and North Korea are powerful nuclear and missile powers. The strategic cooperation between these 3 countries is getting stronger and stronger, as confirmed by the North Korea-Russia summit in September and the China-Russia summit in October. Against the provocations of U.S. imperialism, China and North Korea are increasingly affirming the position that an anti-imperialist war, national liberation war, and national reunification war are inevitable. As we know, in Eastern Europe, as part of the anti-Russian maneuvers, based on the grand chessboard strategy and the color revolution trend, there were massacres of ethnic Russians in Odessa and Donbass after the Maidan coup d'état in Ukraine in 2014, and the Ukrainian Fascist Authority tried to join NATO in 2021. In East Asia, under the imperialist provocations to disrupt China by separating Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xizang, Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia, Taiwan's secessionist maneuvers have already crossed the dangerous line, such as the Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August last year and Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen's visit to the U.S. in April this year. The U.S.-backed Yoon Suk-yeol, who came to power in May last year, has turned South Korea into a darkness with fascist repression as much as Poroshenko and Zelensky, and the Korean peninsula into the brick of war with anti-national belligerence policies. The current situation in Taiwan and South Korea is the most precarious to the extent that it is no surprise if the war breaks out there tomorrow. If either the war in Taiwan or the war in South Korea breaks out, the other will automatically follow. All these military tensions and war crises are obviously caused by the U.S. imperialist policy of disintegrating China and of crushing North Korea. China and North Korea, which have been struggling to uphold the principles of socialism after the counter-revolution that swept the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc in the early 1990s, are in a historic period when they have no choice but to make decisive counterattacks against the persistent and vicious provocations of the imperialist forces. One of the anti-China war signals of imperialists is the new Washington Consensus and de-risking. In April, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan declared the new Washington Consensus at an event of the Brookings Institution, emphasizing that it is not decoupling but de-risking. On the surface, it seems that the Biden administration is pushing for partial de-risking rather than full decoupling claimed by the Trump administration, but this is a fiction, a distorted reflection of the essence. The truth is new Cold War, a full-scale provocation of World War III by the imperialist powers, and through this, they are forming a new front to demonize Russia, China, and North Korea and to deflect their own political and economic crisis. In other words, announcement of the new Washington Consensus is a deception by the imperialist forces, which are provoking wars in East Asia, particularly Taiwan and South Korea, following the war in Ukraine, to shift responsibility of war on China. In fact, during the Trump administration, there was no war in Ukraine, no provocation of Taiwan secession, and Trump had 3 summits with North Korean Chairman Kim Jong-un. It is as if Biden is trying to shake hands with Xi Jinping by extending his right hand in de-risking gesture, but he is hiding the sword of Taiwanese separation in his left hand. While pushing for peaceful rise, China, which is aware of the US's two-faced tactics, makes no secret of the fact that it strongly promotes reunification with Taiwan and territorial integrity through its force in response to provocations, calling it a core of core interests. We must not fall prey to the imperialist deception, but we must consolidate the anti-imperialist front and organize the anti-imperialist struggle over the world more vigorously in preparation for the imminent world war. The World Anti-Imperialist Platform, the platform, launched in this great historical transition period, holding high the banner of anti-imperialism in Paris, France in October 2022. The platform consistently has adhered to the 3 main goals, which are world anti-imperialist struggles against imperialist, ideological battle against revisionism, opportunism, and sectarianism, and strengthening international communist capacity since the establishment so far. The platform held international conferences with communist parties and anti-imperialist political organizations around the world, organized anti-imperialist mass rallies and demonstrations in Belgrade, Serbia, where a neighbor of Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and a weak link of NATO in December 2022 in Caracas, Venezuela, and the epicenter of the Bolivarian Revolution. On the 10th memorial anniversary of Hugo Chávez's death in March 2023, and in Gwangju, the site of the 1980 anti-fascist armed struggle in South Korea, on the occasion of the Third Party Congress of the People's Democracy Party in May 2023. In addition, we launched the Platform News website to strengthen our daily solidarity activities, propaganda and practice, and published the Platform organ. In the coming year, the platform will continue to actively engage in solidarity activities and joint struggles, especially with the people of the Third World countries who suffer from imperialism's direct and constant economic exploitation, political repression, and war manipulation. Against the barbaric repression of imperialism and the fascist forces, in the face of the slander and divisive efforts of the international sectarian opportunist forces, and in order to achieve the 3 goals of the platform has not taken a single step back or faltered, and has always bravely faced and overcome trials and difficulties. We will continue to move forward with our indomitable struggle, chanting the slogans "Proletarians of the world, unite," and "People united will never defeated" from the ranks of the struggle. Like World War II, formed the World Anti-Fascist Front, defeated the fascist forces, dealt a major blow to the imperialist powers, and achieved a great high tide for the communist and anti-imperialist movements. World War III will form the World Anti-Imperialist Front, deal a decisive blow to the imperialist powers, and achieve a new great upsurge for the communist and anti-imperialist movements. We are convinced that this historical path will be the path of fear and defeat for the imperialist powers and their puppet, fascist and opportunist forces, and be the path of hope and victory for the anti-imperialist forces, working class and working people. On the New Cold War. Article written on December 26, 2023 and published in the Platform number 8. We have entered the era of the New Cold War. That term is now commonly used and can be easily found across the media. The New Cold War is a new Cold War between the anti-imperialist and imperialist camps in the modern era. The current situation is, in short, a dangerous one in which the flames of World War III began in Eastern Europe and are spreading, through the Middle East, West Asia, to East Asia. On a global scale, several anti-imperialist battlefields have been formed under one anti-imperialist united front, which is expanding and intensifying. World War III, the anti-imperialist front, and the New Cold War are closely linked. In order to understand the nature of this new Cold War, we should pay attention to the ways in which it differs from the previous Cold War. First, the Cold War and the New Cold War began in very different circumstances. The Cold War began with the end of World War II, but the New Cold War began with the beginning of World War III. The Cold War was initiated to prevent the spread of socialism when the socialist camp had become global after World War II. In order to halt the westward and southward advance of the socialist revolutions that had liberated large parts of Eurasia, Trumanism and containment policies emerged. The Marshall Plan was implemented in Western Europe, and ASEAN grouping was organized by the USA in Southeast Asia. The new Cold War began with World War III, a war provoked by the imperialist camp to isolate and dismantle the anti-imperialist camp, beginning with the launch of Russia's special military operation in 2022. The war in Ukraine had really begun with the Maidan coup d'état in 2014, manipulated by the USA in accordance with the grand chessboard strategy of Zbigniew Brzezinski and following its well-worn color revolution manual. This conflict deepened over the next 8 years with the massacre of 14,000 people in Donbass, before entering a new and higher phase with Russia's special military operation in 2022. This was the beginning of World War III, a global conflict that has deepened with the war in Palestine and the wider Middle East in 2023. The war will have become truly global when the imminent wars in Taiwan and South Korea are also provoked by U.S. imperialism. Second, the camps of the Cold War and the new Cold War have different characteristics. The Cold War was a confrontation between the socialist camp and the imperialist camp, while the new Cold War is between the anti-imperialist camp and the imperialist camp. Therefore, ideological differences were relatively more important in the Cold War than in the new Cold War. In the Cold War, the ideological orientation toward socialism and its positivity were emphasized, while in the new Cold War the emphasis is on the problems and difficulties caused by imperialist domination of the globe. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union and China were early divided inside the socialist camp, but in the new Cold War, Russia and China are united within the anti-imperialist camp. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and China, both very large states, each claimed that they were incarnations of socialism, but in the new Cold War, there is no disagreement about the fact that North Korea, a small country, is the most advanced country on the socialist path. The Cold War began when U.S. imperialism was at its strongest point. The development of the imperialist system in the modern period, during which the imperialist camp was reorganized around U.S. imperialism, coincided with the beginning of the Cold War. This was when the U.S. dollar became the world's reserve currency with the Bretton Woods system led by the USA. Even the currency crisis that followed the U.S. decision to abandon the gold standard was relatively easily overcome. The U.S. was able to conclude an agreement with OPEC around Saudi Arabia on the exclusive use of dollars for oil-related transactions, paving the way for the rise of petrodollars. The new Cold War, on the other hand, began at the height of U.S. imperialism's political and economic crisis. The U.S. presidential election in 2020 embodied a confrontation between the anti-deep state forces and the deep state forces, and it is considered likely that the deep state forces may well be defeated in the 2024 presidential election. U.S. influence is waning everywhere, as has been evidenced by the successive rejections of the U.S.-led UN Security Council sanctions against North Korea's missile launches and the overwhelming passage of the resolution of the ceasefire in Palestine by the UN General Assembly despite U.S. opposition. The USA's status in the global economy has also weakened significantly, as is evidenced by the rise of China and the expansion of the BRICS economic partnership of developing economies. The petrodollar system is coming to an end, with even Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries moving toward the anti-imperialist camp. Third, the Cold War and the new Cold War have the different development arcs. The Cold War proceeded without any hot war between the socialist camp and the imperialist camp. Hot wars were instead provoked by the imperialist camp against the small or weak countries in the Third World. These wars included the Korean War in the 1950s, the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 1970s, and the wars in the Middle East waged by the imperialist camp and Israel against Arab countries. Throughout this period, the imperialist camp conducted its Cold War against its main adversaries, the big countries like the Soviet Union and China, not through hot wars, but through the invisible wars or the wars without gunfire. In the period of the new Cold War, the hot wars and the Cold War were conducted simultaneously between the anti-imperialist camp and the imperialist camp. Today, the imperialist camp is waging in a hot war against Russia, which is a big country, and is provoking another hot war against China, which is another big country. The imperialist camp, while preparing another hot war against China, is already carrying out a Cold War against that country. The declaration of the New Washington Consensus and the de-risking mantra emerged in 2023. As part of this Cold War against China, they represent a cunning and deceptive cover aimed at laying the responsibility for the new Cold War on China, although the American plan is already clear, igniting the war in Taiwan. The war in Palestine and the wider Middle East, which broke out on a new level in 2023, clearly demonstrates that, in the midst of this new Cold War, the imperialist forces are also carrying out hot wars against small countries. While the Korean War in the period of the Cold War was a hot war that the imperialist camp waged against North Korea, a country of national liberation, the Korean War in the period of the new Cold War will be a hot war that the imperialist camp will wage against North Korea, a socialist country. North Korea in the period of the new Cold War is, different with itself in the period of the Cold War, a military power armed with the nuclear missile. The last important difference between these two periods is their likely end results. Although the imperialist camp won the Cold War, every sign indicates that the new Cold War will end in precisely the opposite way. The Cold War ended in a victory for the imperialist camp with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The socialist camp and its allies, the National Liberation Forces, which were at their height because of the victory of the World Anti-Fascist Forces in World War II, retreated after the fall of the Soviet Union. The rise of the socialist camp and National Liberation Forces started the Cold War and went into decline after the Cold War. The new Cold War began with an unprecedented crisis within the imperialist camp. Today, the imperialist camp, trying to resolve its own internal crisis, has contrived the new Cold War in order to provoke World War III. Contrary to their hopes, however, the war in Ukraine and Eastern Europe and the war in Palestine and the Middle East are not going the way the imperialist camp expected and are instead deepening the economic and political crisis within the imperialist camp. The wars to come in Taiwan and South Korea and East Asia, a key for the imperialist camp's strategy to complete the new Cold War, will decisively trigger the further deepening of crisis of the imperialist camp. Russia, China, and North Korea are all nuclear and missile powers armed with hydrogen bombs and hypersonic missiles, while the anti-imperialist countries in the Middle East, including Palestinian resistance forces, are strongly armed and well prepared. Most of all, on all these three battlefields, the anti-imperialist camp is waging a just war in the form of an anti-imperialist and liberation war. The strategic errors of the imperialist camp have been, first, to unite Russia and China in an anti-imperialist camp, second, to push 2 billion Muslims into the anti-imperialist camp, and third, to lose the media war by the obvious contradiction between its anti-Russian propaganda and its pro-Israeli propaganda. As reality is showing, Russia is winning on the battlefield in Ukraine and is every day becoming stronger militarily, politically and economically. In the war in Palestine and the Middle East, it is Zionist Israel that is isolated, while the anti-Zionist and anti-imperialist forces in the region are uniting and increasing their intensity of struggle. The outcome of the wars in Taiwan and South Korea will be no different. The final victory of the anti-imperialist camp, united on the side of justice, is certain. The new Cold War will end in the victory of the anti-imperialists. The historical experience of the October Revolution and the factors that will guarantee the victory of the revolution in the 21st century. Contribution to the International Lenin Century Symposium in Istanbul on January 13, 2024, published in the Platform No. 9. The Russian October Revolution at the beginning of the 20th century had a major impact on the history of world revolution. Lenin's brilliance is that he creatively applied Marxism to the era of imperialism and led the first socialist revolution to victory. The theory that the contradictions between the imperialist powers, owing to uneven development of capitalism, would lead to inter-imperialist and colonial wars, and that the weakest link in the imperialist chain would be broken first in the process, has become an important part of Leninism, describing the objective aspects of the revolutionary situation. Lenin waged a decisive struggle to mature the subjective aspects of the revolutionary situation, the founding of Leninist theory, the strengthening of the Bolshevik organization, and the seizure of power in the Soviets. The theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat characterizes one of the most important factors in the victory of the October Revolution. The ideological battle against sectarianism and opportunism was crucial in strengthening the Bolsheviks as the revolutionary force of the working class, and the Soviets of workers, peasants, and soldiers played a decisive role in the victory of the revolution as a united front linking the party with the masses. In order to succeed in a revolution, both the objective and subjective conditions must be ripe, but it is the subjective side that plays the decisive role. Today, the flames of World War III are spreading from Eastern Europe, through Western Asia, the Middle East, and into East Asia. At present, there is a high probability of expansion of war in Eastern Europe and a high probability of the outbreak of war in East Asia. World War I was a war between rival imperialists, while World War II was a world anti-fascist war. World War III is relatively closer to World War II than World War I as a world anti-imperialist war. While in World War II the Socialist Soviet Union joined hands with the imperialists of the USA and Britain in order to destroy fascism, in World War III, Socialist DPRK and China have joined hands with capitalist Russia against the imperialists. Succeeding from the World Anti-Fascist United Front in World War II, the World Anti-Imperialist United Front is being formed in World War III. One anti-imperialist front and several anti-imperialist battlefields are being formed on a global scale. The war in Ukraine began with the Maidan coup in 2014, intensified with the war in the Donbass region, and entered full swing with Russia's special military operation in 2022. World War III began with the war in Ukraine and is intensifying with the war in Palestine, the war in the Middle East in 2023. It will enter full swing with the outbreak of war in Taiwan and in South Korea. When we talk about the war entering full swing, we are referring to a qualitative change in warfare that is objectively recognized as a state of war. The ongoing war in Ukraine is an anti-imperialist and anti-fascist war, a war of liberation, and a preventive war from the standpoint of Russia, while the war in Palestine is an anti-Zionist and anti-imperialist war and a war of liberation from the standpoint of Palestine. The impending war in Taiwan is an anti-imperialist war, a national liberation war, and a unification war of the fatherland from the standpoint of China, while the war in South Korea is an anti-imperialist and anti-fascist war and a national liberation war from the standpoint of Korea. The DPRK will resolve the national liberation issue through non-peaceful means, and then peacefully resolve the national reunification issue with the People's Democratic regime established in the South. This will involve a process of unification through a federal system. At present, the international communist movement is not fulfilling its historical and political responsibilities. One of the main reasons for this is the revisionist, opportunistic and sectarian behavior of the Communist Party of Greece, KKE, and its satellites. SolidNet, the authoritative solidarity network of the international communist movement, was completely divided at last year's conference in Havana, Cuba, when its organizer, the KKE, declared the war in Ukraine to be an inter-imperialist war. The basis of the KKE's erroneous views, which declare Russia and even China to be imperialist, is its revisionist theory of the imperialist pyramid. As long as there are markets and trade, this theory contends that a society must be described as capitalist. And as long as monopolies dominate on a global scale, every capitalist society must be described as an imperialist one. According to this absurd view that there is only a quantitative difference in a pyramid of imperialists, every country on earth becomes an imperialist country. Even the DPRK, the most staunch socialist country, has markets and trade, so it is capitalist and therefore imperialist. The only exception to this theory, according to their argument, is Palestine, which is a logical contradiction in itself, since Palestine has markets and trade, so it is also capitalist and imperialist. This is why SolidNet made a very vague statement on the war in Palestine at this year's conference in Izmir, Turkey. If we compare the Paris Declaration made by the World Anti-Imperialist Platform in October 2022 and the statement on the war in Palestine made in Athens in November 2023 with the statements of SolidNet, the limitations of the latter, which is led by the KKE, become even more glaring. In this context, the recent sectarian recklessness with which the KKE unilaterally dissolved the European Communist Initiative is not surprising at all. The victory of the revolution depends on both subjective and objective factors, and the subjective factor plays a decisive role. The analysis of a revolutionary situation consists of a subjective aspect and an objective aspect, and here too, the subjective aspect plays a decisive role. The subjective factors for the victory of the revolution are the guiding idea, the leading nucleus and the mass foundation, while the objective factors are the military and economic material means. The subjective aspect of the revolutionary situation is the military, political and economic capabilities of the revolutionary forces. The objective aspect consists of the military, political and economic capabilities of the domestic counter-revolutionary forces and international variables. The revolutionary forces work to strengthen their subjective capacities and deepen the military, political and economic crisis of the domestic counter-revolutionary forces. The international variable is divided into the forces of the dominant powers and the forces of international solidarity. The dominant forces are imperialist and great power chauvinist forces, while the international solidarity forces are the forces for internationalist unity and the forces for international solidarity. The problem of great power chauvinism refers to the error of the big socialist countries in the past in failing to guarantee the independence of smaller socialist countries. The force for internationalist unity refers to the unity of forces that believe in the internationalism of Marxism-Leninism. The fact that China today, along with the most staunch socialist country, the DPRK, is walking a socialist line with Chinese characteristics and has even gone so far as to wage an anti-imperialist armed struggle along with capitalist Russia on a single anti-imperialist front, is the greatest anti-imperialist and revolutionary change since the destruction of the Soviet Union. Today, the imperialist camp is plotting World War III under cover of its new Cold War strategy in order to expropriate its excesses and conceal its own political and economic crisis. Imperialism is the root cause of all wars on a global scale and is solely responsible for provoking them. The imperialist camp is using the tactic of the new Cold War, World War III, in which hot and cold wars coexist, by fabricating the fiction and spreading this lie by means of overwhelming propaganda. World War III would be caused by invasions from Russia in Eastern Europe, Palestine in Western Asia, China and the DPRK in East Asia. However, this is a strategic error that had not only united Russia and China in a single anti-imperialist camp but also is driving 2 billion Muslims into the anti-imperialist camp, all while contradicting its own pretext for war owing to the obvious inconsistency between the West's anti-Russian propaganda and its pro-Israeli propaganda. We note that Russia, China, and the DPRK are all nuclear and missile powers armed with hydrogen bombs and hypersonic missiles, and that South Korea's Yoon Suk-yeol government is in a very vulnerable state. Like the Zelensky and Netanyahu governments, the Yoon government is notoriously fascistic and a steadfast vassal of imperialism. Unlike the fascist forces in World War II, the fascist forces in World War III are all puppets of imperialism, serving merely as stormtroops in imperialist proxy wars. Yoon's approval rating has plummeted owing to his corruption, incompetence, and pro-US unpatriotic character, and he is now frantically trying to complete the fascistization of South Korea and conduct war maneuvers against North Korea, as he is highly likely to be defeated in the next parliamentary election in April. In South Korea, the People's Democracy Party, PDP, is the only staunch revolutionary force that calls for the withdrawal of US troops and the overthrow of Yoon Suk-yeol. The PDP has won legitimacy through 30 years of keen anti-fascist and anti-imperialist struggles and is focusing on strengthening its core competencies and mass base, as well as on strengthening internationalist unity and international solidarity in preparation for the outbreak of war in South Korea. Founded in Paris in October 2022 by revolutionary parties from around the world, including the PDP, the World Anti-Imperialist Platform has set itself 3 major goals: organizing the worldwide anti-imperialist struggle, waging an ideological struggle against revisionism, and strengthening the international communist forces. In pursuit of these aims, it has held international conferences and massive demonstrations in Belgrade in December 2022, in Caracas in March 2023, in Seoul in May 2023, and in Athens in November 2023. We will continue to move forward and struggle for the victory of the Great October Revolution of our era with the scientific convictions of proletarians of the world: unite, and the people, united, will never be defeated. The final victory of the most just anti-imperialist camp is certain. Let's move forward to the final victory. Contribution to the celebration of the 40th anniversary of the Communist Party of the Peoples of Spain, PCP, in Madrid on January 13, 2024. Sincerely celebrating the 40th anniversary of the founding of the PCP, we are confident that you will continue to move forward on the path of revolution as steadfastly as so far. The flames of World War III, which began in Eastern Europe, are spreading through the Middle East and into East Asia. Currently, the probabilities of escalation of the war in Eastern Europe and of the outbreak of war in East Asia are rising fast. In the Middle East, the war in Palestine has already expanded into the wider Middle East since its outbreak. The war in Ukraine really began with the Maidan coup d'état in 2014, deepening over the next 8 years in Donbass, and entered outright war with Russia's special military operation in 2022. World War III began with Russia's special military operation in 2022 and has deepened with Hamas's Al-Aqsa flood operation in 2023. It will encompass outright wars in Taiwan and South Korea. The war in Ukraine is an anti-imperialist and anti-fascist war, a liberation war, and a preventive war, while the war in Palestine is an anti-Zionist and anti-imperialist war and a liberation war. Israeli Zionism is a nuclear-armed force, an ally of U.S. imperialism, and outright fascism. The war in Taiwan is an anti-imperialist war, a national liberation war, and a reunification war, while the war in South Korea is an anti-imperialist and anti-fascist war, and a national liberation war. At the 8th Congress of the Workers' Party of Korea in 2021, North Korea reaffirmed that national liberation can be achieved peacefully if reunification of our country is achieved non-peacefully. There is one front, an anti-imperialist front and an anti-imperialist united front, and several battlefields, anti-imperialist battlefields and anti-imperialist military battlefields. They include the battlefields in Eastern Europe, in Palestine, the Middle East and in Taiwan and South Korea, East Asia. Several countries in the Sahel region of Africa are also fighting wars of the same character. World War I was an inter-imperialist war, and World War II was a global anti-fascist war. World War III is a global anti-imperialist war. World War III is similar to World War II, not World War I. World War I resulted in the emergence of the first socialist country, and World War II led to the formation of a world socialist camp on a global scale. As a result of World War III, the anti-imperialist camp will be decisively strengthened and a new socialist camp will be formed, which will overwhelm the imperialist camp and set the milestone for global independence. The Cold War began with the end of World War II in 1945, and the new Cold War began with the outbreak of World War III in 2022. The Cold War was a confrontation between the socialist and anti-imperialist camps, while the new Cold War was between the anti-imperialist and imperialist camps. The Cold War proceeded without any hot war between the socialist and anti-imperialist camps, but in the new Cold War, hot wars have been conducted between anti-imperialist and imperialist camps. However, the hot wars between Russia, China, North Korea among the anti-imperialist camp and the imperialist countries take the form of a proxy war. The Cold War was won by the imperialist camp, but the new Cold War will be won by the anti-imperialist camp. The period of great upheaval was opened up with the outbreak of World War III, beginning with Russia's special military operation in 2022. It will be transformed into the period of great change when World War III enters a new and higher phase with the wars in Taiwan and South Korea, where the anti-imperialist camp will win. As the final victory of the anti-imperialist camp is confirmed in World War III, we will enter the period of great upsurge. Launched in Paris in October 2022, the World Anti-Imperialist Platform will continue to innovate, like it has been doing, to achieve its three major goals: organizing the world anti-imperialist struggles, waging an ideological warfare against revisionism and opportunism, and strengthening the international communist forces. Holding high the banner of conviction and revolution, proletarians of the world, unite, and the people, united, will never be defeated. We will move forward vigorously to the final victory of the anti-imperialists and of the revolutionary forces. North Korea's Declaration of Subjugation and Revolution in South Korea. Article written on February 25, 2024 and published in the platform number 10. On January 15, 2024, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, made a historic declaration. At the Supreme People's Assembly, SPA, on this day, the chairman of the State Affairs Commission, Kim Jong-un, declared that his country would subjugate the Republic of Korea, ROK, South Korea, in case of emergency. Here are the important points of Chairman Kim Jong-un's speech regarding the situation in Korea. First, Chairman Kim Jong-un stated, "The frequent remarks made by the U.S. authorities about the end of our regime, vast nuclear strategic assets constantly stationed in the peripheral area of the DPRK, ceaseless war exercises with its followers staged on the largest scale, the military nexus between Japan and the Republic of Korea boosted at the instigation of the U.S., etc., are seriously threatening the security of our state moment by moment." And he stressed, "It is our party's strategic plan to defend the country and greet a great revolutionary event through all-people resistance." The provocateurs of war in today's world are always imperialism and its puppets. Chairman Kim Jong-un's speech points to the fact that all armies and people will unite to defend the fatherland and bring about a great revolutionary event if war breaks out as a result of provocative maneuvers aimed at invading North Korea. This great revolutionary event will necessarily involve subjugating the whole territory of the South. Chairman Kim Jong-un went on to call the ROK a group of outsiders, top-class stooges, defining it as an enemy state, a belligerent state in a foreign country. He expressed the DPRK's readiness to completely occupy, subjugate and reclaim the ROK and annex it as a part of the territory of our republic in case of the outbreak of war on the peninsula. Here, the ROK becomes both an enemy state and a group of outsiders, top-class stooges. This is not a logical contradiction, but a dialectical one. It is both the ROK and an enemy state, but it is also the ROK clan and puppets. Thus we can see that the DPRK still essentially maintains a one-state policy. In other words, it internally upholds its existing policy that the DPRK is the only state on the Korean peninsula and is prepared to subjugate the ROK as an enemy state in the event of war. Chairman Kim Jong-un also pointed out, it is necessary to delete such expressions in the constitution as Northern Half and independence, peaceful reunification and great national unity. We have dismantled all the organizations we established as solidarity bodies for peaceful reunification. And further, we should also completely remove the eyesore monument to the 3 charters for national reunification standing at the southern gateway to the capital city of Pyongyang. These are tactical measures valid only until such a time as subjugation has been achieved. In fact, they outline a peaceful process. Subjugation will inevitably lead to the establishment of a military government in the South, ruled by the Korean People's Army. When revolutionary forces in the South have matured enough and a civil government is established through democratic elections, this People's Democratic Government and the Socialist Government of the North will build a unified federal state. In other words, these measures, which seem to deny peaceful reunification, are temporary tactical measures to remove the obstacles to reunification, in force only until an enemy country and a group of stooges called the ROK has ceased to exist. Once a people's democratic government has come into power, then, and only then, can meaningful reunification in an atmosphere of peace and security, i.e., federal reunification, be achieved. The policy of peacefully building a unified federal state is still the strategic goal of the DPRK. To this end, Chairman Kim Jong-un has made it clear that the military force of the North is not a means of preemptive attack for realizing unilateral reunification by force of arms. In other words, the DPRK has no intention of reunifying the country by force, i.e., of actively pursuing forceful reunification. If reunification doesn't take place by force, then it will be a peaceful reunification by means of a federal system. Chairman Kim Jong-un went on to stress, the war will terribly destroy the entity called the Republic of Korea and put an end to its existence. And it will inflict an unimaginably crushing defeat upon the U.S. Thus he showed that the DPRK has different approaches to the ROK and to the USA. Chairman Kim Jong-un has made it clear that if war breaks out as a result of provocations against the DPRK, the ROK itself will be destroyed while the USA will suffer a significant blow, a crushing defeat. This suggests that the DPRK sees the possibility that the USA might not intervene in a war in the ROK. The USA today is following a military doctrine of proxy warfare against its peer competitors, as has been made clear by the way it is prosecuting its wars in Ukraine and Palestine. The same is likely to be true of a possible war in the ROK. If the USA were to engage in a direct war with the DPRK, rather than in a proxy war via the stooge ROK forces, it would risk the DPRK's nuclear attack on the US mainland, which could escalate into mutually assured destruction, MAD, and the annihilation of humanity. With this declaration of subjugation by the DPRK, a possible war in South Korea during this decade, a war in the ROK, would take on the character of an anti-fascist and anti-imperialist war, a war of subjugation, an internal war. This compares with the Korean War of the 1950s, which was an anti-imperialist and anti-fascist war, a national liberation war, and a war for the reunification of the fatherland. The essence of anti-imperialism, anti-fascism, and liberation will remain unchanged, but the DPRK's temporary acceptance of a two-state policy has made a difference. Once the lower of the 2 stages of the democratization of South Korea, namely anti-fascist democratization, has been achieved via non-peaceful means of subjugation, then the higher stage, people's democratization, can be achieved peacefully. The process of making South Korea independent of the USA that must happen in between these 2 stages could be achieved via peaceful or non-peaceful means, depending on the USA's reaction. Under conditions where anti-fascist democratization and anti-US independence have already been achieved, the process of establishing a unified federal government between the People's Democratic regime in the South and the socialist regime in the North can only be pursued by peaceful means. The main points of the speech at 14th SPA of the DPRK in January were already contained in the report on 9th enlarged plenum of 8th WPK Central Committee in December. At the Party Central Committee at the end of last year and at the SPA at the beginning of this year, General Secretary of the WPK and Chairman of the State Affairs Commission, Kim Jong-un, has inherited the ideas and strategies of the revolution and reunification of his predecessors, President Kim Il-sung and Chairman of the National Defense Commission Kim Jong-il, innovating upon them in order to adapt them to today's situation and resolve the long-standing problems of the Korean Peninsula. These problems have existed for 78 years since the division of the country by the U.S. imperialists in 1945, and the DPRK has made it clear that it is now prepared to use bold methods of subjugation to fight a war in the ROK in case of emergency. This concept of a war of subjugation to oust the imperialist proxy regime in the South has opened a decisive period for the South Korean Revolution. With the DPRK's willingness to subjugate the South, the likelihood of a war in the ROK has increased. Moreover, the likelihood of war in Taiwan, which is bound to break out at the same time, has also increased. And as the likelihood of war breaking out in East Asia increases, the possibility of war spreading across Eastern Europe is increasing likewise. Currently, the flames of World War III are spreading from Eastern Europe to the Middle East and look likely to ignite in East Asia, too. But once the flames of war have ignited East Asia, World War III will be in full swing and the new Cold War antagonism facing the anti-imperialist and imperialist camps alike will become clear. Human history will arrive at a great new turning point. We can expect this great new turn in human history to prove a great new turn for world revolution. The Theory of Subjugation First. Article written on March 25, 2024 and published in the platform number 11. Kim Jong-un, chairman of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, formalized the country's new approach regarding the subjugation of the South in a speech to the Supreme People's Assembly on January 15. Although this change in approach towards reunification had already been announced at a plenary meeting of the Central Committee of the Workers' Party of Korea in late December, this decision by the highest organ of state power has another meaning. This declaration of subjugation has changed many things. First, the DPRK made certain theoretical changes to its existing theory of national liberation and democratic revolution, known as the Theory of Liberation of South Korea, and to its theory of national reunification based on the proposal for founding the Democratic Federal Republic of Korea, which was declared at the 6th Congress of the Workers' Party of Korea in 1980. Previously, the WPK noted the intrinsic connection between the theory of national liberation and democratic revolution and the theory of national reunification, formalizing them as a line of independence, democracy and reunification. Specifically, the aim was to achieve anti-US independence, anti-fascist democratization, and national reunification, in that order, with independence expected to come first. The process of revolution and reunification was clearly expected to proceed from anti-US independence through anti-fascist democratization and on to national reunification. When the U.S. Army entered South Korea as an occupying force in 1945, South Korea was recolonized and was eventually fascistized as the pro-Japanese collaborators were transformed into pro-American collaborators. Since the tragedy of Korea's division began with this occupation, the focus on independence first was agreed on not only by the leadership of the DPRK but also by the revolutionary forces of the South. With Pyongyang's declaration of subjugation, however, the theory of independence first has been replaced by the theory of subjugation first. That is, the DPRK now believes that independence, democracy and reunification can only be achieved once the subjugation of the Southern puppet regime has been accomplished. From a theoretical standpoint, we can explain this new outlook as follows: the subjugation of the Southern regime is at the same time a process of anti-fascist and nationwide democratization. These are the two stages of democratization needed in South Korea, a first stage of anti-fascist democratization and a higher stage through the establishment of a people's democratic government in the South. Anti-fascist democratization will require the liquidation of fascist groups, the repeal of fascist laws and the dismantling of fascist organizations. The fascist cliques in South Korea are almost without exception pro-American and pro-Japanese. The subjugation of the Southern regime will at the same time launch a process of nationwide democratization. With the liquidation of the pro-fascist, pro-American, pro-Japanese regime, these factions will be deprived of their economic base and prevented from ever again functioning as a political force. This would be similar, only more thorough, to the process of liquidating Nazi collaborators in France after World War II. In South Korea, however, the scope and extent of this process will be very different, since it is not a matter of a few years but of more than a century of national treason and fascist brutality carried out by the puppet forces of the South, first in cooperation with Japanese and then in cooperation with U.S. colonizers. This process of anti-fascist democratization will at the same time be a nationwide democratization, achieved by the decisive addition of the power of the northern state to that of the southern revolutionary forces. The process of subjugation, by its very nature, can only be a thoroughly unpeaceful process. When democratization has been achieved via the subjugation of the fascist client regime, anti-US independence can easily be accomplished. If the USA continues to intervene militarily in the internal politics of Korea, this can only trigger a non-peaceful response from the Korean revolutionary forces, including from the armed forces of the DPRK. But if the USA does not intervene, choosing to stick to its current proxy war doctrine, independence in Korea can be achieved by a peaceful process by the expulsion of all US troops and weaponry from South Korea. At the same time as anti-US independence is being prioritized, people's democracy will also be promoted. Anti-US independence will not automatically lead to people's democracy, but it is obvious that the former will very much facilitate the latter. People's democracy can only be achieved by a thoroughly peaceful process, after the complete suppression of the fascist puppet forces. To realize a people's democracy in the South, a new administration aimed at realizing the people's welfare will need to be established, based on the nationalization of major means of production. All foreign and comprador capital, the land of reactionary landlords, and U.S. military bases will be reappropriated. On this basis, the problems of unemployment and irregular work will be solved, the debts of peasants and poor workers will be eliminated, free education and free healthcare, and free social housing can all be provided. People's democracy refers to the democratization at the local level. It is essentially the democratization for and by the people of the South themselves, even if the North might be involved. Realizing a people's democracy comes first while the reunification of Korea is promoted simultaneously. It is the prerequisite for the reunification of Korea to achieve the political task in realizing people's democracy. The reunification of Korea will be a thoroughly peaceful process after the liquidation of the pro-US, pro-Japanese and fascist forces and the removal of the US military by the subjugation of South Korea and anti-US independence. Two paths to peaceful reunification are open to a divided nation, the Korean-style federal model or the Chinese-style one-state, two-system model. The difference between the former and the latter is whether the central government is federal or not. The way of peaceful reunification of Korea has been confirmed as a federal system since 1980. This has not changed by the declaration of subjugation. This was clearly expressed in various ways in the January speech. The precondition of the federal reunification is the establishment of People's Democratic Government in South Korea, since a reunified federal state can only be built by the consent between the socialist government in the North and the People's Democratic Government in the South. It will be carried out peacefully and democratically by organizing a nationwide meeting such as the Joint Conference of Political Parties and Social Organizations from South and North Korea in 1948. The establishment of a People's Democratic Government in South Korea should be carried out via democratic elections. Realizing a people's democracy in the political sector will lead to the establishment of a reunified federal state. Realizing people's democracy in political sector is the prerequisite for the establishment of reunified federal state. Realizing a people's democracy in political sector and the establishment of reunified federal state decisively promote realizing people's democracy in economic sector. When realizing people's democracy in economic sector is finished, the next strategic stage to totally solve class discrimination proceeds. At its 8th Congress in 2021, the Workers' Party of Korea amended its party rules, indicating that it was already preparing for this process of nationwide democratization, that is, for the new approach to reunification via subjugation of the South Korean puppet regime. It is instructive to compare the preface to the rulebook as revised in the 7th Congress with the preface as amended in 2021. The former stated, "The immediate purpose of the Workers' Party of Korea is to build a strong socialist nation in the northern half of the republic and to carry out the task of national liberation democratic revolution on a nationwide scale. The ultimate goal of the party is to make all societies Kim Il-sungist Kim Jong-ilist societies and to fully realize the independence of the people." The latter, by contrast, stated, the immediate goal of the Workers' Party of Korea is to build a wealthy and civilized socialist society in the northern half of the republic and to realize the voluntary and democratic development of society nationwide. The ultimate goal is to realize a communist society in which the people's ideals are fully realized. The part of the newly amended rules, to realize, the democratic development of society nationwide has the meaning of the democratization on the nationwide level. While we cannot know that whether DPRK had already defined the concept of subjugation when it revised its rulebook, it openly announced a new line with the metaphorical expression new way. The essence of the theory of subjugation first is the theory of the South Korean Revolution. South Korean Revolution and the Subjugation. Theoretical article contributed to the Party of Communists USA, PUSA. The strategy and tactics of revolution come from the character of revolution, and the character of revolution comes from the character of society. The theory of social character defines the theory of social revolution, and the theory of social revolution defines the theory of strategy and tactics. This is why revolutionaries, first and foremost, focus on scientifically identifying the characters of society and revolution. The character of Korean society is unique. In the 1930s, under Japanese rule, Korea as a whole was a colonial, semi-feudal society, and in the 1980s, under U.S. rule, South Korea became a colonial, semi-capitalist society. The reason why Korea became a colonial, semi-feudal society is that Korea became a colony of Japan in the process of transcending from feudalism to capitalism. South Korea became a colonial, semi-capitalist society because South Korea became a colony of the U.S. when the U.S. military entered South Korea as an occupying force in 1945 and achieved capitalist industrialization around 1980, subordinated to U.S.-Japanese imperialism. South Korea was a colonial, semi-feudal state until 1980. North Korea completed socialist industrialization in 1969. Therefore, there was a severe disparity between the economy and people's livelihood in North and South Korea in the 1970s. As the US and Japanese imperialism rushed to industrialize South Korea in the context of system competition, and as the USA offloaded its heavy chemical polluting industries onto Japan and Japan shifted them to South Korea has had a subordinate and deformed industrialization. When referring to a colonial, semi-capitalist economy, the colonial character, namely subordination, means that all stages of the reproduction process are vertically subordinated to imperialism. The semi-capitalist character, i.e., deformity, means that heavy industry, light industry, and agriculture are all fragmented and deformed in the industrial sectors. Due to the export-oriented economic structure, the heavy industry does not form an internal circulation structure with the domestic light industry and agriculture, and it is lopsidedly enlarged. In the term semi-capitalism, semi means a deformity, neither transition nor compromise. Due to its colonial, subordinated character, it cannot develop from pre-monopoly capitalism to monopolistic capitalism. In defining the theory of social character, the economy is its basis, but the military and politics are much more decisive. This is especially true in societies like South Korea, where foreign troops entered as occupying forces and established a proxy regime with their puppets. All operational authority of the South Korean military is completely controlled by the nuclear-armed U.S. military, and South Korean politics is controlled by the CIA at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul. South Korea has never had an independent military or government, nor has it had a self-reliant economy. South Korean society has not just a tendency of subordination but has been entirely a colony of the USA. The theory of the National Liberation Democratic Revolution originated from South Korea's colonial semi-capitalist society. The term National Liberation Democratic Revolution is a compound of the theory of National Liberation Revolution and the theory of the People's Democratic Revolution. When they are compounded, peoples is omitted. There are various Korean words that refer to people, such as man, the people and the masses. These are distinguishable from each other, but all might be translated into people in English. Therefore, it could be difficult for foreign readers to understand some parts, one of which is the omission of peoples. With its omission, the motive force of the revolution becomes broader as the National Liberation Democratic Revolution, not a National Liberation People's Democratic Revolution. The former revolution does include national capitalists, non-comprador capitalists, as its motive force, but the latter does not. The national capitalists are members of the same nation but not the people. The people refers to all politically oppressed and economically exploited classes and strata. National capitalists are the class that opposes national discrimination in colonies but, at the same time, exploits workers anyway. Just as the colonial, semi-capitalist society is a colony in essence, the National Liberation Democratic Revolution is a national liberation revolution in nature. Separated from the National Liberation Revolution, it should be called the People's Democratic Revolution to clarify the next strategic stage of this revolution, i.e., the revolution to eliminate class discrimination. However, when combined with the National Liberation Revolution, the revolutionary character of the National Liberation Revolution ensures the revolutionary nature of the next strategic stage without the need to add the word peoples. As non-comprador capitalists with national conscience come to be included in the motive force of revolution, this leads to maximal isolation of the enemies, the target of the revolution. From the theory of the National Liberation Democratic Revolution comes the theory of strategy and tactics of this revolution. While the theory of social revolution contains the character, task, motive force, and object of the revolution, the theory of strategy and tactics deals with the goals, means, and methods. It is important to note here that the object of revolution in revolutionary theory coincides with the target in the theory of strategy and tactics. U.S. imperialism and pro-U.S. proxy forces, which are the objects of revolution in the theory of social revolution, are, respectively, strategic and tactical targets in the theory of strategy and tactics. The motive force in the theory of social revolution and the means in the theory of strategy and tactics are almost identical, where we can find the concept of main forces and auxiliary forces. There is a difference between the main forces when carrying out the anti-imperialist, anti-feudal democratic revolution in a colonial, semi-feudal society and a national liberation democratic revolution in a colonial, semi-capitalist society. The former are the working class and peasants under the leadership of revolutionary parties of the working class, while the latter are the working class, peasants, youth and students, and intellectuals with conscience. In Korea under Japanese imperialist rule and in South Korea under U.S. imperialist rule, youth, students and intellectuals have historically played an important role in the national liberation revolution and anti-fascist democratic struggles, and by generalizing their practical experience, since South Korea turned to the colonial, semi-capitalist society, the conscientious and organizable part of the 3 million university students and 10 million intellectuals have been included in the main force. The method in the theory of strategy and tactics based on the theory of national liberation and democratic revolution is the all-people resistance. The two main methods of national liberation revolution are armed struggle and mass struggle, which are combined to be called the all-people resistance. The same is true for the national liberation democratic revolution in South Korea. However, today's South Korea is in a condition where armed struggle cannot be carried out, and as North Korea has taken full charge of this part, the all-people resistance without armed struggle, that is, popular uprising, has become the basic method. South Korea historically had two armed struggles apart from war, the Jeju Uprising in 1948 and the Gwangju Uprising in 1980. Both of these armed uprisings were unsuccessful. There were two successful popular uprisings, the April Uprising in 1960 and the June Uprising in 1987. These two popular uprisings toppled the Ri Syngman puppet regime and the Chun Du-hwan military fascist regime, respectively, and contributed immensely to anti-fascist democratization. However, due to the military coup of Park Chung-hee in 1961 under the control of U.S. imperialism and the winning of a fascist in the presidential election in 1987, South Korea has neither completed anti-fascist democratization nor moved toward anti-U.S. independence. All because of the primary strategic enemy, U.S. imperialism. Therefore, in South Korea, after 1961, the Revolutionary Party of the Working Class was organized as an underground party, and since 1987, an anti-U.S. independent movement has been established as the basic line of the South Korean Revolution. South Korea's society and revolution have featured the relative independence since 1961. It is related to the speech of General Secretary Kim Il-sung at the 4th Congress of the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK, that year. WPK has consistently held to the theory of revolutionary base since August 15, 1945, which means North Korea is the democratic base of the whole Korean Revolution. The division of Korea began with the U.S. military occupation of South Korea, so national liberation and reunification of Korea have the same essence, the realization of national independence on a nationwide scale. As different societies with different characters were formed in the two regions, North and South, it is inevitable that different revolutions would take place in each. North Korea inherited the anti-imperialist, anti-feudal democratic revolution under Japanese imperialist rule and carried out an anti-feudal democratic revolution from 1945. After a three-year war from 1950 to 1953, the country transitioned to a socialist society by gradually socializing all means of production over 3 years from 1956 to 1958. Since then, it has been struggling for the complete victory of socialism. DPRK sees that the strategic stages of realizing the people's independence has 4 stages, and specifically stipulates that the National Liberation Revolution is the elimination of national discrimination, the Socialist Revolution is the elimination of class discrimination, the complete victory of socialism is the elimination of class differences, and communism corresponds to the elimination of labor differences. Therefore, currently, in Korea, a struggle for the complete victory of socialism, which is a regional revolution in North Korea, and a struggle for the National Liberation Democratic Revolution, which is a regional revolution in South Korea, are being carried out at the same time. The National Liberation Revolution is a nationwide revolution because North Korea also has the same interests as the same nation. Thus, from the North Korean point of view, 2 revolutions are being promoted, a regional revolution which is the complete victory of socialism, and a nationwide revolution which is the National Liberation Revolution or National Liberation Democratic Revolution. The National Liberation Democratic Revolution is a formal concept in its completed form, and the National Liberation Revolution represents the essence of this revolution. North Korea sometimes mixes these 2 concepts. South Korea, however, has only one concept of the National Liberation Democratic Revolution. On January 15, 2024, General Secretary Kim Jong-un delivered his speech at the Supreme People's Assembly of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, where he announced the historic declaration of subjugation. This announcement led to changes in the theory described above. The most important change is that independence first was replaced by subjugation first. DPRK had established the 3 points of line for the South Korean Revolution and reunification, anti-US independence, anti-fascist democratization, and reunification of fatherland, condensing the goal, means, and methods in the theory of strategy and tactics of National Liberation Democratic Revolution and adding the theory of reunification of fatherland. Anti-US independence and anti-fascist democratization correspond to National Liberation Democratic Revolution, and reunification of fatherland is literally not a revolution but a reunification. The core task of anti-US independence is the withdrawal of the U.S. Army, the core task of anti-fascist democratization is the removal of the national security law, and the core task of national reunification is the agreement on the federal system. Here, anti-US independence is the antecedent process and central link of the revolution, and without anti-US independence, anti-fascist democratization and reunification are impossible. This is the theory of independence first. However, in the January speech above, the theory of subjugation first was raised, that is, North Korea recognized the South Korean government as a state and defined it as an enemy state, belligerent state, and primary enemy. It also declared that if the Republic of Korea, ROK, attacked the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, it would immediately strike back and subjugate the entire territory of the ROK. In this context, the subjugation refers to the suppression of the revolt, i.e., annihilating the ROK, a group of outsiders' top-class stooges, and annexing it to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. This will result in the liquidation of the pro-US, pro-Japanese, and fascist groups, which are the ROK clan. In other words, from the perspective of the South Korean people, it means that the politically oppressive and economically exploitative ruling class would be eliminated. In other words, anti-fascist democratization will be completed. Initially, the anti-fascist democracy was the democratization in the southern region since there is no fascist force in North Korea. However, in the current situation in which South Korea has failed to achieve this task by itself, the fascist forces in the South are becoming belligerent forces, and they are driving to war against North Korea. So now North Korea also has the task of accomplishing an anti-fascist democratization. It means that anti-fascist democratization was changed from a task at the local level to a nationwide one. When analyzing this way, it becomes clear why the WPK amended the preface of its rule at its 8th Congress in 2021. It is instructive to compare the preface to the rulebook as revised in the 7th Congress with the preface as amended in 2021. The former stated, "The immediate purpose of the Workers' Party of Korea is to build a strong socialist nation in the northern half of the republic and to carry out the task of national liberation democratic revolution on a nationwide scale. The ultimate goal of the party is to make all societies Kim Il-sungist Kim Jong-ilist societies and to fully realize the independence of the people." The latter, by contrast, stated, "The immediate goal of the Workers' Party of Korea is to build a wealthy and civilized socialist society in the northern half of the republic and to realize the voluntary and democratic development of society nationwide. The ultimate goal is to realize a communist society in which the people's ideals are fully realized." The part of the newly amended rules, to realize, the democratic development of society nationwide means democratization on the nationwide level. The subjugation of South Korea is essentially the nationwide democratization, the anti-fascist democratization. In brief, with the January speech, the theory of independence first was replaced by the theory of subjugation first. Concretely, the line of independence, democracy, and reunification changed into the line of subjugation, independence, democracy, and reunification, in which the subjugation is the nationwide democratization, and the democracy is the democratization at the local level. The former is the anti-fascist democracy and the latter is the people's democracy. There are two stages in realizing democracy. The first stage is the anti-fascist democracy to eliminate the fascist forces, and the higher stage is the people's democracy to nationalize the major means of production and to realize the welfare of the people. When the anti-fascist democracy is achieved in an unpeaceful way via the subjugation of the South, the tasks of people's democracy can be realized in a peaceful way. The declaration of subjugation hastens the decisive moment for the Korean Revolution and the South Korean Revolution. The flames of World War III started in Eastern Europe, passed through West Asia, and spread to East Asia. With the new Cold War strategy and war maneuvers of the imperialist camp, the possibility of an outbreak of wars in South Korea and Taiwan is increasing, as with the war in Ukraine and the war in Palestine. Once DPRK responds to the war provocation of U.S. imperialism and pro-U.S. fascist forces by starting the war of subjugation, the South Korean Revolution will enter its decisive stage. The imminent war in South Korea is, at the same time, an imminent revolution in South Korea. Imperialism will be burnt to death in flames of its own wars. Contribution to the International Forum in Rome, hosted by the International Initiative for Peace, on April 20, 2024. The flames of World War III, provoked by imperialism, are spreading from Eastern Europe through the Middle East to East Asia. Imperialism is at the root of all wars in the 20th as well as 21st centuries. Today, imperialism cunningly provokes wars and then blames them on the anti-imperialist camp. The overwhelming propaganda makes lies believable, proving that Joseph Goebbels' ploy is still valid in this century. But it cannot hide blatant double standards and logical contradictions between the anti-Russian propaganda and pro-Israeli propaganda. For the imperialist camp, which has lost its pretext for war, military violence is definitely the last bastion. But the entire world has come to realize that even it doesn't work in this era. After Zionist Israel attacked the Iranian consulate in Syria on April 1, anti-imperialist Iran struck back on the Israeli mainland, hitting the Nevatim air base, where the F-35s that bombed the consulate were stationed, with hypersonic missiles. Israel is insisting its attack on the Isfahan air base in Iran was retaliation, but it is an unscrupulous deception of humanity, who clearly knows who provoked the war. The anti-imperialist camp certainly does not want the escalation of the war, the expansion of the war in Palestine into the Middle East, and the expansion of the war in Ukraine into the wars in Palestine and the Middle East, but the imperialist war drive, like a runaway locomotive without brakes, has already gone beyond Eastern Europe and penetrated the Middle East. At present, it is the conscience and intellect of humanity, and their materialization, the righteous war deterrence of the anti-imperialist camp, that have the power to stop imperialism's barbaric war drive, its deadly World War III maneuver. Regrettably, humanity has reached the point where it has to pin its hopes on anti-imperialist political power and war deterrence as the last resort to protect its destiny and life in the face of the explosion of World War III. The imperialist camp, provoking World War III step by step, has even carried out the heinous terrorist attack in Moscow. Convinced, based on objectively corroborated evidence, that the intelligence services of the USA, the UK, and Ukraine are behind it, the Russian authorities are placing primary responsibility on Ukraine, while simultaneously preparing a fundamental response to its manipulators, US-UK imperialists. The evidence is now so overwhelming that it is no secret who the founders of the so-called Islamic terrorist organizations are and who is funding and arming them. The imperialist terrorists will pay the price and will ultimately be destroyed. All these streams of manipulation, provocation, and incitement are gathering to form the great river of wars in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and finally flowing into the ocean of World War. The imperialist strategy to provoke World War III and create a new Cold War is becoming increasingly apparent. The confrontation between the imperialist and anti-imperialist camps, confirmed by the wars in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, is finally heading toward the confirmation of World War III and the new Cold War through the war in East Asia, which will soon erupt. As everyone acknowledges, the war in Ukraine promoted the war in Palestine and the Middle East. The wars in Ukraine, Palestine, and the Middle East have promoted the wars in East Asia, that is, wars in South Korea and Taiwan. U.S. imperialism is leaving no stone unturned to revive Japanese militarism and provoke local and proxy wars in East Asia that will reach a climax of World War III, led by the South Korean fascist Yoon Suk-yeol, the Taiwanese separationist Lai Ching-te, and the pro-American puppets in the Philippines. Even if U.S. imperialism is threatening by dispatching 4 aircraft carriers and tactical nukes on stealth aircraft, it cannot change its doomed fate. As the world knows, it is impossible for the imperialist camp to win on the 3 fronts of Eastern Europe against Russia, the Middle East against Iran and other anti-imperialists, and East Asia against North Korea and China at the same time. It is evident in the constant defeat of the U.S. European imperialist NATO in the war in Ukraine under the Zelensky puppet regime, in Israel today being on the defensive by Hamas, Hezbollah, Ansar Allah, Houthi forces, and Iran's anti-Zionist anti-imperialist armed struggle, and in its retreat to proxy wars instead of directly confronting Russia, North Korea, and China. Within the anti-imperialist camp, the strongest nuclear missile powers Russia, China and North Korea have already been united in forming a leading force, while anti-imperialist Islamic forces such as Iran, Hezbollah, Ansar Allah, and Hamas, along with anti-imperialist forces in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, are joining this just anti-imperialist action and struggle. This huge flow is a powerful anti-imperialist force never seen in human history. The anti-imperialist camp, which encompasses the overwhelming majority of the world's humankind, will crush the foolish World War III maneuver of a handful of imperialists and move forward vigorously to a lasting peace and a new world where the people are the masters of politics and economics. Just as darkness cannot beat light, justice and truth will prevail. Imperialism will perish in the flames of wars it causes. The united anti-imperialist force will make it so. The World Anti-Imperialist Platform will become a spearhead of it. The people, united, will never be defeated. The people, united, will certainly win. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. The most important feature of the new Cold War. Article written on April 22, 2024, and published in the platform number 12. The most important feature of the new Cold War is the position and role of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, within the anti-imperialist camp. As the most thoroughly socialist country, the DPRK occupies a key position and plays a pivotal role in this alliance. Of all the existing socialist states, the DPRK adheres to socialist principles most thoroughly. Its society implements socialist principles in all fields of politics, economy and culture, and is growing stronger and more robust. The DPRK is building a powerful socialist state with the complete victory of socialism as its strategic goal. It is a historic miracle that the DPRK, which is not a big country, was able to win wars against the imperialist powers of Japan and the United States, to complete its socialist industrialization in 14 years under conditions of the most draconian economic blockade that has been imposed by the imperialists since the Korean War 70 years ago, and to go on to become one of the world's handful of nuclear missile powers. This is the result of the DPRK's adherence to the principles of independence in politics, self-sufficiency in the economy, and self-reliance in defense, implementing the revolutionary essence of Marxism-Leninism in the specific conditions of Korea. This also explains why the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK, a revolutionary party of the working class, is the longest ruling party in the world today. The essence of the present world situation must be understood in the context of World War. As of April 2024, the flames of World War III, entirely provoked by imperialism, are spreading rapidly from Eastern Europe to the Middle East and are traveling towards East Asia. The military actions of Russia, the Middle Eastern resistance forces in Iran are all unavoidable and legitimate exercises of self-defense against the war provocations of imperialism and its proxies. The war in Ukraine began with the Maidan coup d'état in 2014, intensified during the 8-year war in Donbass, and entered full swing in February 2022 with the launch of Russia's special military operation. The war in the Middle East began its latest phase with the launch of Operation Al-Aqsa Flood in October 2023, has been intensified by the actions of Hezbollah and Ansar Allah, and entered full swing with Iran's Operation True Promise in April 2024. World War III, which began with the launch of Russia's special military operation and intensified with the latest outbreak of war in the Middle East, will enter full swing with the war in East Asia, which will be its climax. The war in East Asia consists of the two wars that the imperialists are driving towards in South Korea and Taiwan. In their historic Mutual Defense Agreement of 1961, DPRK President Kim Il-sung and Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai agreed that if one party was attacked by imperialism, the other would automatically come to their aid. President Xi Jinping's visit to North Korea in 2019 reaffirmed this pact. Since then, China has actively resolved the Hong Kong issue and taken a firmer approach to the question of Taiwan separatism. For China, the Taiwan issue is a crucial one that must be resolved at all costs, since the imperialists would like to use it to trigger a chain of artificially created separatist movements in the country. War in East Asia will be waged between socialist DPRK, North Korea, China and capitalist Russia, with its socialist heritage, on one side, and the US and Japanese imperialists with their principal puppets in the Republic of Korea, ROK, South Korea, and Taiwan on the other. As in the other theaters of war, it will be a war between the anti-imperialist camp and the camp of imperialism and its local proxies. While the USA will mobilize all its Indo-Pacific forces for such a war, both the DPRK and China have indicated that they are ready to use tactical nuclear weapons if their enemy should launch a preemptive strike against them. With its short vertical length, evidenced by the proximity of the two capitals, its high concentration of advanced and conventional weapons, and its hosting of the largest U.S. military base in the world, the Korean Peninsula is bound to become the main focal point of such a war. In January this year, the DPRK's leadership declared at the Supreme People's Assembly that they have defined the ROK, which is a group of outsiders' top-class stooges, as a primary enemy state, and if the ROK provokes a war of invasion, the DPRK has made plans to immediately subjugate the southern half of Korea, eliminating the ROK clan. To prove its words with actions, the DPRK has conducted intensive military exercises for an advance into the south, including hypersonic missile tests and state-of-the-art high-tech tank warfare in response to the US-ROK joint war exercises aimed at North Korea. The DPRK's weapons tests and exercises are being conducted in a thoroughly practical manner in a series of concentric circles centered on the north to reach South Korea, Japan, Guam, Hawaii, and finally the US mainland itself. The expected war in South Korea, which would be the Second Korean War, would be an anti-fascist, anti-imperialist war and a war for the subjugation. It must be the decisive trigger for the South Korean Revolution. War in Taiwan would be an anti-imperialist, liberation war and a war of Chinese national reunification. Thus we can see that the coming wars in South Korea and Taiwan will decisively change the destiny of the peoples of South Korea and Taiwan. War in East Asia will be a trigger for a great turn not only in the region but in the whole world, just as the Battle of Stalingrad was in World War II. Both the DPRK and China are socialist countries, the DPRK being the most thoroughly socialist country without any condition-like Chinese characteristics. Through its victory, the socialist DPRK will significantly influence not only the South Korean people's revolutionary prospects but also the revolutionary future of the whole world in ideological and systemic ways. The DPRK's historical experience of constructing a powerful state with independent politics, a self-sufficient economy, and a self-reliant military while overcoming the arduous march during which it kept alive the principles of socialism during the most difficult conditions of the 1990s, is a precious asset of revolution for victory in the struggle against imperialism, fascism and reaction of all types. The process of a national liberation democratic revolution in South Korea, a colonial semi-capitalist society, will infuse scientific conviction and revolutionary optimism into the oppressed and exploited people around the world who are groaning under a deformed capitalist society which is completely subordinated to imperialist powers. World War III will reach its height when the war spreads to East Asia. Its outcome will be decided by the overwhelming power of military force and united people, by the all-people resistance highlighted in the January speech by Chairman Kim Jong-un. The possible expansion of the war into Eastern Europe and the fate of Zionist Israel will depend entirely on whether the imperialist camp persists in frantic maneuvers. The anti-imperialist camp would certainly prefer for World War III to end in East Asia, but if the imperialist camp continues with its provocations, the anti-imperialist will respond them with dealing a crushing blow against imperialists. The strongest anti-imperialist force in history is now taking shape. Within it are united the world's strongest nuclear and missile powers of the DPRK, China, and Russia alongside the broad masses of the oppressed from around the world, including the majority of the world's 2 billion Muslims. This force is simultaneously and continuously striking at the already collapsing imperialist world, causing its leaders to tremble in fear of catastrophic destruction. Today's great upheaval in world affairs will go forward to tomorrow's great transition and to a great upsurge of the future impelled by the great unity of the anti-imperialist camp. Socialism is the only future for humanity, and the DPRK is a beacon of that socialist future. Imperialism may have won a temporary victory in the Cold War, but it will inevitably find itself the ultimate loser of the new Cold War. The eventual defeat of imperialism, in its essence, means global independence heading to socialism. The World Anti-Imperialist Peace Force will certainly win. Contribution to the 11th Korean International Forum in Gwangju, South Korea, on May 19, 2024. We sincerely wish for peace. We never wish for war. All anti-imperialist forces worldwide, without exception, feel the same way. The world's anti-imperialist forces are the true world peace forces, but unfortunately, reality is going against our wishes. In 2022, the war in Ukraine entered full swing. It began with the Maidan coup in 2014, intensified with the war in Donbass for 8 years, and finally began in earnest in February 2022 with Russia's special military operation. The war in West Asia, war in the Middle East, started in October 2023 with Hamas's Al-Aqsa flood operation, which erupted into the war in Palestine, intensified with the involvement of Hezbollah and Ansar Allah, and then entered full swing with Iran's True Promise operation in April 2024. The flames of World War III, provoked by imperialism, are spreading from Eastern Europe to West Asia and are traveling towards East Asia. Just as no one can deny that the war in Ukraine triggered the war in West Asia, it is also true that the wars in Ukraine and West Asia are triggering the war in East Asia, specifically the wars in the Republic of Korea, ROK, and Taiwan. The wars in the ROK and Taiwan are inextricably and closely linked, with the outbreak of one automatically leading to the outbreak of the other. An agreement to this effect between the DPRK President Kim Il-sung and Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai in 1961 was supposedly reaffirmed by the DPRK Chairman Kim Jong-un and Chinese President Xi Jinping in 2019. The Korean War in the 1950s was an anti-imperialist war, a national liberation war, and a reunification war from the DPRK's point of view. Currently, the DPRK has declared that if the war in the ROK breaks out, it will be a war of subjugation. Chairman Kim Jong-un's speech at the Supreme People's Assembly on January 15 has given much weight to it to be called a declaration of subjugation. When we analyze his speech, the war of subjugation is an anti-fascist and anti-imperialist war and an internal war. This is because it defines the ROK as a group of outsiders' top-class stooges, while calling it an enemy state and a belligerent state. In contrast, the war in Taiwan will be an anti-imperialist war, a national liberation war, and a war for reunification. In terms of fascistization, the ROK and Taiwan are on different levels. China and Taiwan do not define each other as primary enemies and can freely come and go to one another. However, both the DPRK and China have virtually shared the same view that the peaceful path is closed and that only the non-peaceful path remains to fulfill the strategic goal of territorial integrity. China still does not explicitly deny the peaceful path, but in practice, has seen it as unlikely since the election of hardline separatist Lai Ching-te as Taiwanese president in January and has been remarkably building up its military forces. The DPRK, through its January speech, proclaimed to delete the concept of peaceful reunification during the War of Subjugation and to annihilate the ROK in the event of emergency. We should note that the prerequisite of emergency has been defined as an invasion war against the North, but at the same time has been abstracted and defined more comprehensively as war provocation, armed conflict, and armed response. There is no doubt that military tensions and hostilities between North and South Korea are now at their highest ever since the Korean War. In short, the likelihood of war in the ROK is at an all-time high. If the war in the ROK breaks out, the war in Taiwan will follow, and vice versa. World War III began with the war in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, has escalated with the war in West Asia, and is likely to enter full swing with the wars in the ROK and Taiwan in East Asia. There is a lot of debate about whether we are in World War III or not, but when the wars in East Asia break out, everything will be clear. World War III is part of the new Cold War. The imperialist powers are plotting World War III under their new Cold War strategy. Immediately after World War II, the imperialist powers adopted the Cold War strategy to deflect from their own political and economic crises and directly fought hot wars against the smaller anti-imperialist countries. However, now the new Cold War has begun alongside World War III, and they are waging hot wars in the form of proxy warfare against the most powerful anti-imperialist countries. In addition, while during the Cold War, socialist forces formed the leading force and national liberation forces formed the auxiliary force within the world anti-imperialist camp, during the new Cold War, the DPRK, the most steadfast socialist country, and China, a socialist country with Chinese characteristics, as well as Russia, which has a socialist heritage, formed the leading force as nuclear missile superpowers, and other anti-imperialist forces, including the 2 billion Muslim forces, formed the auxiliary force within the world anti-imperialist camp. As of May 2024, Russia's overwhelming predominance in the war in Ukraine and Israel's Zionist feeble performance in West Asia demonstrate the vulnerability of the imperialist camp. In particular, the imperialist camp's logical contradiction between its anti-Russian and pro-Israeli propaganda has lost its pretext for war, which is eking with its manipulation. The World Anti-War and Peace Force is a world anti-imperialist peace force in essence, as evidenced by the U.S. university student protests. It is the imperialist countries and their vassal countries that are experiencing political and economic crises, whether in terms of the approval ratings of those in power or terms of economic crisis and devastation of public welfare. It is also imperialism that is at a disadvantage in armed confrontation, as evidenced by the level of development and deployment of hypersonic missiles, which are considered an absolute weapon. Moreover, the imperialist camp is not as keen on winning the war as the anti-imperialist camp, and it has the decisive weakness of having to stick to proxy warfare with the disadvantage of expeditionary wars. It is not only Zelensky in Ukraine and Netanyahu in Israel who are experiencing a severe political crisis as imperialist proxy ruling powers. Yoon Suk-yeol of the ROK and Kishida of Japan also are. In particular, Yoon's clique is facing an impeachment crisis after losing the general election in April. Due to the worst economic crisis, a desperate devastation of people's livelihood, unprecedented corruption, and outright incompetence, Yoon is on the brink of a precipice of withdrawal and imprisonment, resulting in his finding an exit of fascistization and war. The problem is that with the defeat in the general election, the situation has become unfavorable for fascistization. Yoon Suk-yeol clique has no choice but to move further toward the path of war under the control of U.S. imperialism. It means that U.S. imperialism is pushing him into the same situation as Rhys Syngman's clique of the ROK, which lost the election in 1950. In fact, following last year, this year has seen the most extensive dangerous war exercises against the North continually and simultaneously, involving the U.S. and sometimes even Japan. The formation of the Asian version of NATO is expected to become apparent soon, with Yoon and Kishida attending the NATO summit in Washington in July. The Korean peninsula has become a tinderbox. The people of the ROK can no longer tolerate the Yoon Suk-yeol government. The reality of the eve of war beyond corruption, incompetence, and fascistization shows our people that if we do not immediately put an end to the Yoon government, the war in the ROK will break out, which will cause untold misery. This is another reason why Yoon's clique was harshly judged by the last general election and why the candlelight uprising demanding Yoon's resignment is spreading and intensifying. Yesterday, the People's Democracy Party vigorously carried out an anti-fascist and anti-imperialist demonstration here in Gwangju, the city famed for anti-fascist armed struggle, the city that loves democracy and peace, with the slogan of Down with Yoon Suk-yeol, along with the World Anti-Imperialist Platform. To implement the three major goals of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, the People's Democracy Party is holding anti-imperialist peace demonstrations nationwide on the first Saturday of every month with the flag of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform and is doing its best to play its role as the platform's organizer for the success of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform's congresses and meetings, which are being held with accelerating speed. Our party will keep the two main slogans of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, Proletarians of the World, Unite, and The People, United, will never be defeated, as scientific convictions and will unswervingly struggle to the end for the victory of our people and the people of the world, the victory of the world peace movement and the world anti-imperialist forces.